We have invited Michael Nepview with the he's on the economic staff of the American Farm Bureau Federation to add some additional perspective on some of the issues that are challenging the cattle industry, and particular reference to some topics that we've already seen some legislation introduced on the federal level to address some of these topics.
All right. Thank you very much, Travis, and thanks for having me on for this. I think it's when talking about what's going on in livestock markets right now and the subsequent policy proposal that we've seen floating around or introduced on the Senate or House side, you can't start without talking about the COVID-19 curve. So this is actually a little bit of a dated map. If you've been following the news anytime lately, this is mid-July. You've seen that curve start to go back upwards across the U.S. I know different areas of the U.S. are affected different ways, but what that really impacts is consumers' ability to go out and eat at restaurants. So, and their confidence overall, just consumer confidence in the economy. So consumers' willingness to spend, regardless of how impacted they are by COVID in their individual communities, is really what's going to be driving a lot of what I talk about in these next few slides. So I always like to show this just to show the drastic change, what we've seen happen with the way Americans spend their food dollars. So over the last few years, we've actually, as a country, America has spent the majority of the money that they spend on food away from home. Now that's at restaurants. It also accounts for things like, school lunch programs, colleges, baseball games. The way Americans are spending money on food most of it was actually away from home. And beginning in March and April of 2020, that drastically changed. And you can actually see the drop in that blue line is what we do in food services and drinking establishments. It was somewhat replaced by an increase in grocery store spending, but not 100% was made up. So part of what's driving that is grocery stores are not selling as much value-added product like you get through the food service. You could probably get a burger at the grocery store for about a quarter of what you pay at a nice restaurant for that. So I also want to point this out because you're going to see in some of these subsequent graphs is how drastically it impacts different areas of meat consumption. So what we buy from the grocery store is not always the same kinds of meats that we're buying at restaurants. Think about the average American consumer. I know Farm Bureau members may be a little bit more experienced grilling, but the average American consumer is not going to go out and be grilling their own filet mignon, beef tenderloin, things like that. Those kinds of cuts are highly exposed to that food service and restaurant, and those traditionally have been big drivers of the cutouts. So we've seen some wacky stuff going on with both the beef and pork cutouts. To talk a little bit about that, before we get there, there's also what's going on outside of the meat markets and just food spending in general at grocery stores. As consumers went and emptied out grocery store shelves back in March, we saw a resulting price increase at the retail level. So this is percent change in retail prices for various food products. You can see what actually was impacted the most was eggs. We saw some action at individual state levels where state attorney generals were talking about price fixing investigations going into companies. We saw a lot of that going on. Ground beef is another one. You think about the consumer when they're going to the grocery store and they're trying to stock up their freezer for the pandemic. They're going to be buying things like ground beef, chicken thighs. They're not going to be packing their freezer full of steaks. They're going to be, switching to more of those economical cuts in order to stock up their freezers. So you saw a resulting price increase, excuse me, in ground beef and pork chops and things like potatoes as well. So what that ultimately did, and this is what we saw, at the producer level, there was definitely a price decrease in terms of fed and feeder cattle. A lot of what was driving that was on this supply side issue. So I kind of break it out into two different events. What happened back in March, early April was much more of a demand response. That's when we saw the price spike at the retail level. That's where we saw consumers worried about having to hole up for quarantine, and they were trying to stock up their freezers. And so that's where we saw, pictures of empty grocery store shelves floating around social media. That was more of a demand event. There was no shortage of food in the country at that time. We were in no danger of having a shortage of food in the country at that time. Since then, there's a separate issue that happened, and that's where you really see the spike in the cutout, is a supply issue. Now, this goes back to, COVID was a real disease that was going through and impacting people at the labor issue of the slaughter facilities. So a lot of this was, workers were either A, unable to go to work because they were sick, they were B, worried about getting the virus, so they didn't want to go to work, or C, you think about schools being closed, how hard is it to work from home with your kids? Well, if you're not able to work from home and you have to go into the plant to start fabricating carcasses, basically, you can't leave your kids anywhere. So in some cases, there's no childcare options. So that's where we started seeing a reduction in slaughter capacity. No animal was immune from this. So I know I have beef and pork up here, but you also saw a little bit similar in some of the further processing and poultry, but not to the reason we focus on beef and hogs is they were just much harder hit. We saw very drastic reduction in cattle and hog slaughter. You can just see it in the graph. That blue line that drops back down. However, I talk about that drastic reduction. We've also seen a pretty strong recovery. So that happened a lot faster than pretty much anybody else was expecting. It happened faster than everybody was predicting. You look on the hog side, we're actually above last year. That blue line is above the red line, or we're above where we would have been these past couple of weeks as well, if we had not even experienced the pandemic. So slaughter capacity there is largely cut up. On the beef side, they're sitting around 95% to pretty much equal with where they were last year. So again, we're mostly recovered in the slaughter capacity. Now, I'm saying that doesn't mean we've worked through the backlog of animals. That's going to be an issue in the hog markets, particularly because given where we were in the December quarterly hogs and pigs, we're expecting a lot more animals up even beyond what we had backed up in the system, because that you see that dip in slaughter down to 450,000 head, or around 1.5 million head for pork. When you see that dip, those animals don't just disappear, they start backing up in the system. So we got to be running ahead of capacity, ahead of where we were last year, in order to try and work our way through this backlog of animals. Now, that backlog is going to be with us for several months. It's going to be with us at least through the fall. So that's going to be at least weighing on animal supplies, and that's going to be weighing on prices that producers are likely, or at least feed yards, are going to be seeing for their animals. So we can switch. What does that mean for beef and pork production? Makes sense. If you're able to process less animals, you're going to have less production. So this goes back to that supply issue where, grocery stores started limiting some of what consumers were able to purchase. And, it's because we actually were starting to see some issues and hiccups in the supply chain. Again, that doesn't mean we were at risk of a food shortage in this country. It just means that you're going to see regional disruptions in the overall availability of certain types of animal proteins, the variety of proteins that you're used to getting. But again, I do like to stress at no point during all of this was our food system upended to the point where there just wasn't any meat in this country for consumers to consume. One thing I'll point out is you see, at least on the beef side, more so than the pork side, this is percent change year over year. So we saw the decline. We're actually back above a year ago for a couple of weeks in a row now. What's really driving that is we're slaughtering a little bit less than we were last year in terms of number of animals. We're just bringing a lot heavier animals to market. Again, it makes sense. If they're backed up in the system, they're still gaining weight as much as they try and slow down the weight gain. We're seeing the average carcass weight increase pretty substantially over where it normally is this time of year. So a lot heavier animals coming to market means a lot more beef in the supply chain, which means moving forward, we just got over some high grilling season demand surges, which normally push prices up a little bit at that time in the summer. Throughout the rest of the summer and early fall, we got two more grilling events where we can see a strong push in demand. But other than that, we're going to be looking at high supplies of beef and probably lower prices of beef moving throughout the fall as well. Now, this is the graph that I show that tends to get a frustrated response from a lot of our farmer members, and understandably so. This is the daily choice box beef cutout. So remember, I was talking about there's two different events going on here. That first one is that first bump on the left side. You see it happen around mid-March through mid-April. That was really demand driven. That was consumer panicking. Consumers emptied out the meat case. The grocery stores tried to refill their meat case, basically, and then you had a lot of grocery stores competing for a very limited set of supplies, basically. That's why you saw that spike. It started coming back down once consumers stopped stocking up their freezers, and then we got hit with the supply issue, which is where you saw the cutout more than double. Go from, earlier in the year, we were much closer to 200. Then it spiked just a little bit under 480. It did come down fairly quickly, it did not come down as quickly as it went up. It's the rockets and feathers phenomenon. You see it in gas prices all the time. They shoot up really quickly, but it takes them longer than it should to come back down. And I know that's also frustrating to a lot of our members, and it's something that we've communicated to USDA and some of the other regulators, and I'll also mention some of what's going on in terms of the policy world. Right now, we're just looking at more of the market world. So again, the choice box beef cutout is back to, right now, lower than it was earlier in the year, which brings us to our next slide, which is what I call the live to cutout spread. Very careful here not to call these margins because they aren't. This is just what the packer is able to sell the outputs. So you think the cutout and as well as byproduct minus what it costs them for the inputs, the cattle or the hogs. In this case, this is beef. I should have put that in the label, but this is for the beef live to cutout spread. It's not taking into account things like labor. And one thing I do have to point out in the interest of being, honest on this one is, this is not taking into account any increased costs due to COVID. So a lot of the packers did see substantial increases in their cost. But even so, I know it's costing them a lot more to process. They're having to pay their workers more to get them into the plant. That is still just a massive spike. The graph on the right is the same graph. I just had to zoom in so you could see where we are now because that spike is just too large. We are still at historic levels for that live to cutout spread. So again, I didn't say it's an actual measurement of margins, but it kind of gives us an idea of how healthy margins are, and they're pretty exceedingly healthy right now, let's put it that way. They're lower than they were at the height of the Tyson fire, lower than they were back in early March, but still historic levels above where they were the last several years before that. We haven't seen levels like this since, again, Tyson and COVID, those two black swan events that the cattle and beef markets have seen. So I talked a little bit about the beef cutout. Pork cutout, we saw a similar situation. That's the graph on the right. I will mention that pork has been here before in recent memory. So it was a lot more shocking to the beef market because nothing like that has ever been seen before. But pork, we had a pretty disastrous event back in 2014 that really just decimated the pork industry, the hog industry. And that was the porcine endemic virus, diarrhea virus, basically. So as a result of that, we saw a severe shortage in pork. And that's why you look at the prices in 2014, even at the worst of the COVID-19 pandemic, we still didn't quite see the highs that we saw back in 2014. But we still did see a similar spike. And also, to be fair, the pork cutout didn't respond quite as high and as constrained as the box beef cutout did. Now, what this translates back to what our producers are seeing in terms of prices for their animals. This graph is going to show that blue line is a feeder index reported on the CME. It's a rolling average. I think it's 7-day for feeder cattle. Then we have the 5-area fed cattle price is the red line, and then the yellow line is the dotted line is the cutout. Just kind of showing you directionally what happens. So if you think about it, and this is one, I've spoken with a lot of extension folks, all the professors, and, I'm very upfront. I've spoken to a lot of people a lot smarter than me on this one. And looking at it, everybody can agree, directionally, what direction the prices went made sense with the supply issue. So if you have a constrained supply and you say you knock out as much as 25% of the national processing capacity, you asked me before COVID, what happens to the beef cutout? Well, it's going to go up. There's a severe supply shortage potentially. Okay, well, what happens to fed and feeder cattle? Well, they should go down. That part makes sense because processing capacity is down, which means you essentially have an immediate oversupply of cattle in the market. Where people kind of get hung up, and it's hard to really, I don't know if justify is the right word, but it's hard to get your head around, is the magnitude to which that cutout increased, especially relative to what you saw happening with the magnitude of the cattle price decreases. So that's something, you know, our producers are seeing every day. It's frustrating for a lot of them and perfectly understandable. And as a result of this stuff happening, I already talked a little bit about the pork cutout. Sorry, I'll switch over that. Is we saw action on the Hill, basically. So this is the first package that we saw go through the Hill. It's the CARES rescue package. In it, you had, what I want to point out here is what matters most to agriculture is that $9.5 billion to the Office of the Secretary, which is what they were able to put a lot of money into the CFAP program, as well as that CCC replenishment, which they combined that $9.5 billion with what they already had in the CCC in order to pay out to producers. And this isn't just to livestock, this is to all of agriculture. And any day now, we've been assured that the CCC should be getting that $14 billion replenishment for any kind of future programs that USDA may need to be doing. Because, you know, rest assured, this is something where they knew whenever they constructed the first program that wasn't an end-all be-all. They knew they needed to get something out the door quick. They needed to put together something the best that they could do in as short amount of time as possible, with the understanding that there would be additional help coming down the road, which is what we're hoping that money from the CCC replenishment comes through for. We talked about how things are going to be divvied up. And if you go back and you look at, they actually have a public record of the CFAP spending, and we've seen that, you know, cattle are a big beneficiary of it. Dairy is another big one, hogs and pigs. So it doesn't quite match this early distribution of what people were thinking was going to be the breakdown, but we do see that, you know, cattle are getting a bulk of the livestock stuff, as well as dairy and hogs and pigs. CFAP direct payments, looking at cattle and pigs, there's basically two separate payment rates. This was, I'm sure many of you have already participated in the CFAP program, but for the cattle side of things, the first payment rate was a payment rate that you would receive for animals that you actually sold for slaughter, basically, or sold to the feed yard. So if you sold the animal, you get that dark red payment rate, which is for, you know, fed cattle, $214 a head. This is all per head payment rates. Feeder cattle, they have two different payment rates depending on what weight you sold them at. They have other cattle, they have pigs as well. And then there's this additional payment rate, which is, let's say you sold half your cattle and held on to half. The half that you held on to would be eligible for this $33 per head payment rate, which, you know, this is something we immediately heard from our members, is that, you know, that's not nearly enough. That's something that we communicated to USDA and made sure that we're going to work with them in the future to make sure that that we're more adequately reimbursed for what the producers were hit with during COVID. I also mentioned that the payment rates here, you would have been paid out 80% of the total payment when you first applied, with a subsequent 20% coming down the line. The reason they did that, it's simple, even though it's not a happy answer, is money. They didn't have enough, and they wanted to make sure that everybody got some payment, so that when we got that replenishment, then maybe we can start moving forward with the extra 20% of the payment as well.